They were closing the coffin when she leaned over me and whispered, "You have 1 week." I still had the funeral program in my lap. My fingers accidentally caught it, crushing the edge. I didn't turn around. I sat there paralyzed, pretending not to have heard her, while the preacher kept talking about peace and closure. My son Malik had died at 33 from a sudden heart attack, and he was the only person in this world I truly cared about. And now I'm sitting next to his coffin while his wife Jasmine, wearing a custom-made black dress with crocodile tears streaming down her face, is already planning my eviction. She squeezed my shoulder after saying it with such false tenderness, as if she were comforting me. I didn't move. Before we begin, please like and subscribe. Tell me and the others. What life lesson should everyone learn before it's too late? Share it in the comments. Thank you. She got up and greeted a new guest. "It's been so intense," someone behind me said. "Losing a husband at his age, I can't even imagine it." I wanted to laugh, but my chest burned. I remained silent during the service, through the closing prayer, even as people began to head to the fellowship hall for the reception. When it was time to leave, Jasmine made sure to help her grandmother into the car, but she left me alone. She rode with Aaron in the car without saying a word. The car smelled of her cologne, and I thought maybe that would break me, but I was too busy trying to decipher what game she was playing. She made us all come inside the house. She gave a short speech about strength and Malik's humor and how much he loved his family. I stood behind the kitchen island without saying a word. She served wine, made toasts, and hugged people like a widow on TV. But I noticed small details. The family photo had disappeared from the stairs. They had taken his military footlocker. She was already erasing him. After everyone left, I went to my room, the one I had inhabited for 7 years. The door was open, my blankets were folded, the bedside lamp was unplugged. I checked the dresser. Half the drawers were empty. The jewelry box had disappeared. The closet had boxes labeled "Mama's Things." I stood there for a minute as if my brain needed time to process what my eyes were seeing. I walked past the kitchen. Jasmine was sitting at the dining table with a glass of wine and her phone in her hand. She didn't look up. I cleared my throat. "Did you pack my things?" Finally, she looked at me and said, "I was just getting organized. There's a moving company I can call when you're ready." Then she smiled as if it were a polite offer. I asked her where my jewelry was. She told me, "Some of it is in the safe. You wouldn't want to lose anything while people were coming and going." I said I never asked her to touch my things. She took a sip of her wine. "Malik and I talked about it," she said. "It's nothing personal. We just assumed you'd want to move back in with your sister." "I don't have a sister. She knows that." I stared at her. "This is my house." She shrugged. "It was his house. I would have liked us to have space to grieve." Then she picked up the phone as if I wasn't there. I left before I said something stupid. I went back to my room and checked the drawers again. Trying to stay calm, trying to think. The box I kept under the bed had disappeared. I opened the closet and saw a container with a label for old documents. I took it down and checked it. Receipts, old mail, warranty papers. Then I found it, my folder with medical records, old bank statements, and my passport. I kept searching. My heart accelerated. I couldn't find the deed, the one that was in my name, the one Malik insisted we keep together when they bought this house, and I helped with the down payment after he lost his job. That deed had to be in this house. I checked it twice. Jasmine's voice came down the hall. "Hey, do you want the leftover potato salad or should I throw it away?" I didn't answer. My hand was shaking. The deed had disappeared. The next morning, the kitchen was silent and the smell of coffee had already dissipated when I walked in. Jasmine was at the dining room table typing on her laptop like it was any Tuesday. She looked up and said, "Good morning. I'm just checking some moving quotes." I opened the refrigerator. My containers with my name had disappeared, replaced by a neatly stacked Tupperware that wasn't mine. I didn't ask. "Moving," I said. She smiled without looking at me. "Well, you said you wanted to manage things according to your schedule. I thought it might help." She took a sip from her mug and clicked something quickly. I went to the living room. My son's old recliner had been replaced by an imitation leather armchair. His blanket was folded and tucked behind the television stand like a dog bed. "Where's Malik's recliner?" I asked. She shrugged. "It was old. It no longer fit in the room." I looked at her and stared. A week has passed. Now she seemed annoyed. 9 days have passed. I'm not going to sit in a dead man's chair, Helen. That was the first time she uttered his name as if it didn't mean anything. I turned around and left just to breathe. I sat on the porch steps, took out my phone, and called a lawyer that Malik recommended to me once when we were updating our wills. The secretary said he could see me that afternoon. I didn't tell Jasmine where I was going. I simply left. The lawyer, Mr. Washington, remembered Malik immediately. "A good man," he said. "I'm sorry for your loss." I told him what was happening, how Jasmine had told me I had to leave, how my name was on the deed, and how the document had disappeared. He asked me how long I had been living there. 7 years, I said, ever since they bought it. He asked me if I had written proof of having paid the down payment. I told him I used a cashier's check. I still had the receipt. His eyes lit up. "So, could we have something?" I asked him to explain. He said if my name was listed in the deed and I had proof of payment, she couldn't force me to leave, legally. He told me to look for the cashier's check receipt and, if possible, the original purchase documentation. I thanked him and drove home gripping the steering wheel too tightly. Jasmine was on the phone when I returned, pacing near the hallway. "No, she doesn't know anything," she said. She lowered her voice when she saw me. "Everything's sorted now." I walked past her and went straight to the attic. Malik had been storing boxes up there since before he got married. Old school records, taxes, moving receipts. I went upstairs with my heart pounding. I opened the boxes with force. There was dust everywhere. I found his university box, his box of military records, and then one labeled Home Purchase. My breath caught in my throat. I yanked it out, sat down on the attic floor, and started skimming through it. Closing statements, homeowner's insurance, bank loan approvals, and there it was, a manila envelope with the final delivery deed. I opened it and stared. My name, my signature, his, dated, notarized, filed. I stayed there for a second, processing the information. Jasmine was bluffing. Either she didn't know or she did and hoped I wouldn't find it. I put the folder in my coat and went downstairs. She was at the foot of the attic staircase. "Looking for something?" she asked, raising her eyebrows. I looked her in the eye. "Just old papers. Nothing important." She smiled broadly. "Thank goodness, I wouldn't want you to get stressed." Then she turned around and walked toward the kitchen as if nothing had happened, as if we hadn't just had a silent confrontation. That night, I made copies of the deed and scanned them to my email. I created a folder just for lawyers. I wasn't stupid. She thought she was winning, but now I had the advantage. I just needed to be careful. Around 9 p.m., she came in with 2 glasses of wine and said, "I thought we should talk to clear things up." I took the glass, but I didn't drink. She sat down on the sofa across from me. "I know things have been tense lately, but Malik always said this house was for us, for our future family." I didn't say anything. She looked down at her cup. "I don't want things to get ugly, I just want to move on." I looked at her hand, her left ring finger still wearing her wedding ring. She looked up. "Do you understand, right?" I asked. "Have you spoken to a lawyer?" Her face tightened. "No, I didn't think it was necessary." I smiled. "Perhaps you should." She narrowed her eyes for a second. She took a sip of wine. "Are you threatening me, Helen?" I smiled back. "No, I was just thinking out loud." She stood up slowly. "I hope we can make it easy." I nodded. "Me too." She walked down the hall with the glass still in her hand. I waited until she was out of sight. I took out my phone and checked the scanned deed one more time. My name, clear as water. She thought she had me in a difficult situation, but she had no idea what I had just found upstairs. The next morning, I printed 2 copies of the deed and put them in a sealed envelope addressed to my lawyer. I dropped it off at his office without knocking first. I told his assistant it was urgent and left before she could ask questions. Back home, Jasmine was in the garage cleaning shelves as if she'd already gotten over the pain. She looked up when I came in. "Hi," she said casually. "I'm just throwing things around. I hope you don't mind." I nodded and went inside, pretending not to notice that Malik's fishing gear was missing. I went to my room, opened the top drawer of my nightstand, and found it locked. That drawer had never been locked before. I took a flathead screwdriver and opened the lock. The bottle with my prescription wasn't inside, neither was my cash, nor the envelope with the money. She was sending a message. She wanted me to know I no longer had any privacy. I sat on the bed and breathed through my teeth until the burning in my chest subsided. Then I did something I hadn't done since Malik died. I opened his filing cabinet in the office. In the 3rd drawer, I found a folder labeled Refinancing Options. Inside were the most recent mortgage statements with both our names, dated less than a year ago. That mattered. Jasmine hadn't been added even after the refinancing. I took a picture and saved it to the cloud. I heard Jasmine's voice in the hallway talking to someone on the phone. Yes, she's still here. I know it's awkward, but she has no real right. Pause. No, her name is not on the current utility bills or taxes. Everything will be fine. I went out into the hallway and made just enough noise so that she knew I had heard her. She turned around quickly, her eyes wide. "Is everything all right?" I said. "You should be very careful what you say in this house. The walls are thin." Then I went back to the kitchen and started making coffee as if nothing had happened. The rest of that day, she didn't bother me. Around 6 p.m., I passed by the room and saw that the family portrait had been replaced by a landscape print. Blue mountains and empty snow. No one was there. I stood there looking longer than I intended. That night, she ordered Chinese food and left mine in the bag on the counter without a note, without courtesy. I took the food, closed the door, and locked it from the inside with the wedge I'd been saving since last week. I was going to take the risk. At 2 a.m., I heard slow footsteps outside my room, intentional. I got up and pressed my ear to the door. They didn't knock, just a pause, then footsteps receding. In the morning, the alarm clock power had gone out exactly 1 minute before it should have rung. I checked the circuit breaker. All the switches were fine. I didn't say a word to her during breakfast. She offered me coffee as if it were nothing. I declined. Then I went back to the lawyer. This time I sat down across from Mr. Washington and handed him the photos, the refinancing documents, and copies of the deed. He reviewed them one by one, nodding. "She has no legal standing," he said. "Her name never appears, and you have contributed financially and residentially for more than 7 years. If she tries to evict you, she'll lose." I asked if I could file a preemptive claim. He nodded. "We'll draft a notice of shared ownership and prepare a legal response to any false claims. If she serves you with anything, notify us immediately and we'll respond." I asked about the risk. He said, "Only if you lose your documents. Keep them safe and stay calm." I drove home with a newfound silence in my chest, neither pity nor fear, but concentration. When I entered, Jasmine was folding clothes on the sofa. She looked up and asked me, "Did you go somewhere?" I said, "Just needed some fresh air." She raised an eyebrow. "You suddenly seem confident." I smiled and said, "I just remembered something important." She stared at me intently for a second and then said, "Well, I hope it doesn't complicate things for you." I opened the refrigerator and saw that my labeled food had come back again, the same handwriting. That night, I heard her talking again on the phone in the guest room. Yes, she's behaving strangely. Perhaps I'll have to fast forward time. Another pause. If she finds that file, we're lost. She didn't know I already had it. She didn't know the file was already in the hands of a lawyer, but now I was sure she was hiding something more serious than a simple property dispute, and she was about to discover that. 3 days later, Jasmine organized what she called a morning gathering for Malik's friends and coworkers, something she casually announced while having coffee like it was a birthday brunch. "Just a little closure," she said, pouring almond milk into her cup and ignoring the second one she'd left beside her. She didn't ask me to help with the preparations, which was fine. She barely greeted me that week, except to ask me to keep the guest bathroom clean and not to mention personal matters when speaking to anyone. I didn't argue, I didn't say anything, but I watched. I watched her as she took out the old folding tables and filled them like she was organizing a cocktail party, and how she filled the bar with imported cookies and fancy appetizers as if we hadn't just buried him. The first guest arrived just after 6. Deshaun, Malik's friend from work, gave me a long hug and whispered, "He couldn't stop talking about you. He said you were the only person he could always count on." I nodded, holding back my tears. Then others came. Neighbors, co-workers, and some friends from Jasmine's Pilates class. I recognized some of them, others I didn't. Jasmine floated around the room like a gracious hostess, glass in hand, giving brief speeches about Malik's generosity and light. I stayed near the back wall, watching her smile at strangers while oblivious to the fact that she had emptied his room and thrown away his books. At one point, someone asked me how I was coping. I said, "As best as I can, considering I still live here." The woman seemed confused. I added, "Malik and I were co-owners of the house. Jasmine takes care of it now, but I'm still living here." She raised her eyebrows. "Oh, I thought you said it was hers." I smiled politely. "Easy mistake." An hour later, I saw Jasmine watching me from the other side of the room. Her face was still smiling, but her gaze had changed, tense and scrutinizing. She approached when everything calmed down and said, "Can I talk to you for a minute?" I followed her into the hallway. She closed the door behind us. "You're trying to start something," she said. I answered a question honestly. She took another step closer. "Don't be funny, Helen. These people don't need to know about paperwork." I crossed my arms. "Then stop lying." She stared at me, then composed herself. "Look, this is delicate. These are people who cared about Malik. They're here to support me." I said, "Then you better not throw a party in the house you're trying to erase him from." She blushed. "If you don't want to be here, you can leave." I smiled. "Oh, I'm not going anywhere." She approached, whispering just like at the funeral. "You think you're clever, Helen, but you don't know how this works. I'll make sure you regret staying." Then she came out with the same polite expression and greeted the next guest as if we hadn't just threatened each other in the hallway. I remained silent for the rest of the night. I observed. I listened. I noticed that a guest, a man in his 40s with a shaved head and a designer coat, stared at me intently as if trying to identify me. He spoke briefly with Jasmine near the hallway and left early. Something about the way she moved, cautious and in a low voice, bothered me. After everyone left, Jasmine cleaned up quietly. I didn't offer her any help. She didn't ask. At midnight, I passed by the guest room and saw a manila folder in her open bag. It wasn't there before. I went back to my room, grabbed my phone, and silently took a picture through the crack in her door. The folder said, "Document copies, Plan B." That night, I waited until I heard her take a shower. Then I went out into the hallway and opened the bag. Inside, there were several folders, one with the house deadline and another with the label Electronic Signatures 2023. I didn't take anything. I just took pictures. One file contained a screenshot of a will with a digital signature I didn't recognize. The bottom corner said, "Filed on March 4th. Malik passed away February 2nd. He hadn't signed anything in March. I stood there holding my breath, frozen as the water was cut off. I moved quickly, closed her bag, and went back to my room and waited silently as she walked past in the hallway humming, wrapped in a robe. My hands were still shaking, but now I had more than just the deed. I had proof that she was trying to take control. Something more serious was happening, and tomorrow I was going to investigate further what the electronic signatures of 2023 were supposed to cover. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of sobbing in the kitchen. It wasn't loud sobbing, but a delicate, silent cry that needed to be heard. And when I entered, Jasmine was standing by the sink in a bathrobe with a crumpled handkerchief in her hand, staring out the window like she was in a soap opera. But as soon as she saw me, she turned around and wiped her eyes with the palm of her hand, forcing a smile as if she were being brave for someone, and said, "I'm sorry, it's just that sometimes it hits me again." And then she put a hand on her stomach, not in a way that was dramatic, but enough to make me realize. I froze because it was new. She looked up and said softly, "I didn't want to say anything until I was sure. I'm pregnant, Helen." And for 5 seconds, I couldn't speak. I couldn't move because I didn't understand anything, not after everything I had seen. I asked her, "How far along?" And she quickly replied, 8 weeks, maybe 9. And that made everything fit together because Malik had been dead for 10 weeks. I stared at her, trying not to show the alarm that was tearing at my chest as she approached and placed the ultrasound on the table as if it were a letter of triumph. I picked it up, turned it slowly, and looked at the corner, its name, the clinic, and the date printed in black letters, not from 10 weeks ago, but from 4. And at that moment, I realized that the pregnancy had nothing to do with Malik. It was all about control. And she said, "I used a donor. Malik and I had talked about it just in case. He wanted me to have a piece of him." And I knew, in that instant, that was a lie, that Malik would have said something so serious to me. I looked at her and said nothing. I simply sent the photo back without reacting, and she added, "I hope now you understand why it's so important for me to have this space for the baby's sake." And then I realized that she was crafting a sympathy narrative, something she could use in court if necessary, the grieving widow who is expecting a child and is forced to share a house with an unstable mother-in-law. I nodded slowly and told her that changed things. Her face softened as if she believed I was giving up, as if her little performance had worked. But as soon as she left the room, I grabbed my phone and took the picture I had taken of the document she was carrying in her bag and compared the date of the ultrasound with the one on file. 4 days difference, both from the same week, both planted as evidence. I forwarded them to Mr. A. Washington with a brief message. "We need to talk." And in less than an hour, he called me back and said, "This helps us if she alleges dependency or emotional difficulties. We can compel her to show her medical history and the consistency of the timeline." And I asked her, "What if she faked everything?" And he said, "Then it's fraud, and if you keep documenting it calmly, we'll win before it goes to trial." And I said, "She's trying to provoke me into reacting." And he replied, "Then don't." And I didn't. I stayed quiet. I cleaned the bathroom, folded the laundry, and smiled when she would make comments like, "This baby is going to need a lot of space," or "It's going to be difficult raising a child in a hostile environment." And every time she looked at me, it seemed like she was calculating how close I was to exploding. I just nodded and stayed silent until that Friday when they slipped an envelope under my door in a manila folder with an urgent 48-hour notice. And inside was a typed document, clearly not presented to the court, indicating that I had 48 hours to vacate the property due to emotional instability and personal threats. I stood there watching it, my heart pounding, not out of fear, but because of the clumsiness with which she had given me a lie that I could refute with a single email. And upon rereading it, I noticed a final line at the end that made my hair stand on end. If I didn't leave, the police would intervene, and I could face a negligence lawsuit. And that was it. That was the card she had decided to play. She was going to present me as a dangerous old woman, unstable and violent, even though I had done nothing more than prepare toast and fold towels. And now she was forcing me to move, panicking, waiting for me to run before counterattacking. And I knew what I had to do. I had to stop waiting for her to cross the line because she had already done it. I didn't say a word after reading that fake eviction notice. I simply folded it slowly and put it away in a new folder with the other documents that Jasmine had conveniently given me over the past 2 weeks, and I went straight to Mr. Washington's office, without an appointment, without delay, because it was no longer about defending my right to live in the house. It was about dismantling the fantasy world she was trying to build. And when I sat down across from him and handed him the latest file, his eyes walked through the last line and, in fact, he chuckled, not for fun, but out of disbelief, and said, "She's threatening you with negligence charges toward an older person, while you are the one being emotionally harassed, documented, and manipulated economically." And I told her everything about the timeline of the fake pregnancy, the IVF clinic label, donor date, manipulated photos, the phone calls I overheard at night, and the conversations I documented without even raising my voice, and he said, "We've already moved past the civil conflict. This is disputed territory, fraud, and if she altered financial documents or used your identity in any way, we could face criminal charges." I asked him, "What is the fastest way to prove it?" He replied, "We request a judicial subpoena for the presentation of evidence regarding her digital records, electronic emails, text records, medical presentations, and banking data." I asked him, "Will a judge grant it?" He replied, "If we prove the falsified eviction, pregnancy inconsistency, and misrepresentation of the property deed, all documented, we don't just have one case, we have leverage." I sat there breathing with the feeling that for the first time since Malik's death, I was no longer surviving. I was about to turn the situation around on the person who thought she could erase me. On the way home, I stopped at a print shop and ordered 3 bound copies of everything: the deed with my name, the refinancing record, the ultrasound with the false date, the text of the eviction threat, the names of all the people who saw her try to rewrite the history of the house during the morning meeting, and I labeled the file on the spine of the folder like Evidence, Carter Case. Then I saved 1 copy in my safe deposit box, another in my lawyer's office, and another one under the floor of my closet, where she wouldn't find it even if she wrecked the house. And when I got home that night, she was in the kitchen on a video call with her headphones on, laughing and discussing a new real estate opportunity, and told the person on the screen, "Yes, I will have access to the home in 2 weeks." And I froze behind the wall, realizing that she wasn't just trying to win the house out of pain or insecurity, she was planning to resell it, perhaps even planning to sell it, which meant she wouldn't even stay there in the long run. She just wanted the property rights for her own benefit. I entered the room and made sure she saw me. I didn't say anything. I went to the refrigerator, took out a bottle of water, and stared at her until the call ended. She turned slowly and said, "Do you need anything?" I told her, "Just a heads up. If another envelope arrives at my door, make sure it has a court seal. Anything less goes straight to my lawyer." She blinked rapidly as if I would have slapped her and then said, "Now you're threatening me?" I replied, "You started the paperwork war, Jasmine. I'm just keeping mine legal." I left before she could answer, and that night I did one last thing. I opened Malik's old email account, which I had shared access to when I helped him find a job years back, and the password, the lyrics to his favorite song, and his service number were still working. And what I found wasn't much, mostly job applications and bills. But then I found a folder marked as Estate, and inside there were PDF files including one labeled Draft Will dated February 2023. And when I opened it, I lost my breath because the signature at the end did not match his handwriting. The notary's seal was cut off and reused. And worst of all, the document mentioned Jasmine as the sole heir and owner, without mentioning me, even though the date was a week before his death. I printed it without touching anything, my heart pounding, realizing that was what she was trying to hide. The file she must have buried in the folder I saw in her bag. And this version contained metadata with her computer's name. It wasn't Malik's or a law firm, just Jasmine K. Drafts. I sent the file directly to Mr. Washington and wrote to him, "She forged his will." I didn't even flinch. I pressed send. And the next morning, Washington called me before I'd finished my toast. His voice was calm but firm. He said, "We're filing the lawsuit today." And that was the moment everything changed from a discreet defense to an active offensive, because now we had proof of digital forgery, evidence of intent to defraud, evidence of legal documents manipulated with a traceable digital signature. He explained to me step by step the next steps. File a motion to freeze any transfer of title to the property. Request judicial review of the entire will. File a fraud alert with the probate court and place a protective notice on the house to stop any attempt to sell or refinance unauthorized. And he added, "You don't have to notify her. The court will do it." And I nodded, even though she couldn't see me, because finally someone else would speak for me, and I wouldn't have to continue feigning my helplessness in the house I helped pay for. And by noon that day, Jasmine must have sensed a change, because she became strangely friendly. She offered to prepare lunch and asked me if I wanted to help her buy things for the baby. And when I said no, she tilted her head and looked up and asked, "Everything okay?" I just smiled and said, "We'll see." And that afternoon, while she was out, I received a call from a process server who said, "We'll be delivering documents later today, don't get involved." And I said, "Trust me, I won't." And I sat on the sofa with the blinds open and waited. And around 5 p.m., she arrived in her new truck with 2 shopping bags in her hand. And as soon as she stepped onto the porch, a man in a gray jacket got out of his car, went upstairs, and said her full name with a clean, rehearsed tone. She paused, confused, and said, "Yes." And he handed over a thick envelope and said, "You have been notified. Estate fraud and property seizure." And she blinked with her lips slightly parted and asked, "What the hell is this?" And he said, "You'll have to read it." And he walked away without saying more. And I watched her from the living room window, holding the envelope as if weighing it, looking at the seal. And then her eyes turned toward the house, toward me. And I didn't move or blink. I just sat there until she entered with quick steps and slammed her fist on the dining room table. She opened it, glanced at the first page, then the second, and I heard her whisper, "No, no, no." And then louder, "He's lying. This is all lies." She turned to me and shouted, "What did you tell them?" I stood up and said, "I didn't tell them anything. The documents did." She threw the envelope on the floor and stormed into the kitchen, muttering, "I'll fix it. This isn't going to happen." I didn't say anything because she wasn't talking to me anymore. She was talking to the world that had finally told her no. And that night, she didn't eat, didn't speak, didn't even leave her room. And the next morning, I found her walking around the front garden, talking on the phone with someone, whispering, "Get me a lawyer who knows how to bury this." And then, "I don't care what it costs. She's just an old woman." And I stayed on the porch with my arms crossed, letting her know I'd heard every word. And 2 days later, the trial date was set. A preliminary hearing to establish the validity of the will and the property deed. And when we arrived, Jasmine came in wearing a cream-colored jacket and holding her fake ultrasound as if it were an accessory. And her lawyer began with a quiet performance about widowhood, grief, and maternal protection. But Washington refuted it with irrefutable evidence, comparisons from Malik's real digital signature, which she herself had sent, metadata records from her laptop which showed that she herself had opened and edited the document, plus the refinancing logs that ruled her out completely. And then came the key point. The deed was in my name and legally registered without modifications or manipulation by Jasmine. And when Washington said, "Your Honor, my client has been co-owner of this property from day one," the judge leaned forward, reviewed the file, and said, "Counselor, this is crystal clear." I saw how Jasmine's position crumbled, her shoulders slumped and her mouth twitching, as if she wanted to scream but couldn't. And then the judge said, "The court rises. Temporary freezing of the property. Helen retains legal co-ownership. All eviction claims are void. As for the will, it is subject to fraud investigation." Jasmine's lawyer whispered something quickly, and she looked at him as if he had betrayed her. And I stood there, firm, silent, strong. Because this wasn't a victory, it was simply the truth finally spoken out loud. As we left the courtroom, Washington turned to me and said, "Now let's see if she holds on or packs her bags." As I got into the car, I checked my phone. I saw an email from the judicial system confirming the acknowledgement of full ownership. I smiled not out of spite, but out of relief, because she could twist stories and falsify photos as much as she wanted. But now the law knew who I was, really. The house was too quiet the next morning, not peaceful, but heavy like the silence before a storm. And when I walked into the kitchen, Jasmine was already there, dressed in black as if she were going to another funeral, sitting at the table with her untouched coffee and a notepad with a stack of notes in front of her, full of names and phone numbers. And she didn't look up when I came in. She just said, "Do you think you've won?" I poured my coffee without answering, letting her fill the silence with her own unravelings. And she continued, "Do you think that just because you got that judge to believe your story, it's over?" And finally I turned around and said, "It wasn't a story, Jasmine. It was the law." And that made her react because she stood up so fast the chair scraped against the tiles and said, "You can't steal everything from me." And I looked her straight in the eyes and said, "You tried to erase me from a house I helped build, from a life I was always a part of, and you used a false will and a fake pregnancy to achieve it." She was paralyzed with her mouth agape. She tried to change the subject, saying, "I was in mourning. I didn't understand." Not anymore, because the drama was dead and we both knew it. And I said to her, "Pack your things. I'm showing you the same respect you never showed me. I'm not going to call the sheriff yet." She opened her mouth as if she were going to scream, but closed it again. She grabbed her phone and stormed out of the house. I sat down and took a sip of my coffee, savoring it finally without fear in my throat. And during the following hours, the house remained silent, not only on the surface, but also inside, like the first breath after months underwater. I entered Malik's old room, closed the door, and sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the empty walls that he himself painted. And I said softly, "We're okay now, sweetheart. I promise." And then I opened the top drawer, the one I hadn't touched since the funeral, and I found something unexpected. A folded sheet of paper written in handwriting, unsigned, dated 3 weeks before his death. And it began with, "If something happens to me, I want you to know that I'm sorry." And I felt a knot in my chest as I read line after line of guilt, frustration, and regret over how he had let Jasmine isolate him from people, how he knew she was manipulative but tried to fix it, how he felt that he could no longer tell me things because she made him want to choose sides. And at the bottom of the letter he said, "Don't let her take everything. This house has always been ours, not hers. Do what you have to do, Mom." And my hands began to tremble, not from pain but from clarity, because even in death he had tried to give me the last word. I took the letter, scanned it on my phone, and put it in my drawer next to my deed. And as evening fell, Jasmine returned, her face contorted with anger, and said, "You're going to regret this. I'm going to the press. I'll tell them that you intimidated a grieving widow." And I said, "Then I will show them the dates of the ultrasound, the metadata of the will, and the letter Malik left me." And she paled as if she had seen a ghost because she knew nothing about that last part. And she whispered, "Are you bluffing?" And I said, "Try me." And she turned around and left, slamming the door so loudly that a picture frame fell off the hallway wall. And I didn't even flinch. I simply picked up the frame, put it back, and prepared dinner like any other night. And while the pasta was boiling, I wrote to Washington. I found a personal letter that reinforces the case. I'll forward it. And he replied in seconds, "Send that bulletproof." And that night, for the first time in months, I slept with the window open, no door wedge, no spare key underneath the pillow, just silence and fresh air. And in the morning, I heard her packing boxes. On Sunday morning, The hallway in front of Jasmine's room was filled with cardboard boxes. Some were labeled, others weren't. Some were held together with tape that barely held. The flaps looked as if she'd packed them in a hurry. And I didn't ask her if she was really leaving because I already knew she had run out of legal options and any deception she clung to had collapsed under the weight of the court documents and her own arrogance. And when she entered the kitchen, at first she didn't speak. She simply opened a drawer as if looking for something that had never been there. Finally, she turned to me and said, "I'll be out on Friday." I nodded without smiling, without sarcasm, just calmly, as if it were a logistics meeting, not the end of a month-long war. She added, "You can have your house back." And I said, "It was never yours to give away." And that affected her more than screaming, because she froze for a second. Then she looked away as if she wanted to spit something out, but she couldn't find a word that wouldn't incriminate her. I walked past her and put the kettle on the stove, not to be dramatic, but because I really wanted tea and to learn that the most powerful thing I had left was not to react, simply to continue living as if she were already gone. And later that afternoon, she invited 2 friends over, shouting in the hallway, helping her lift boxes, and I stayed in my room while they whispered things like, "She's crazy," and "How did you live here with her?" And I didn't say one word because those weren't questions worth answering. And the next morning, she attempted one last pathetic move. She called Deshaun, an old friend of Malik's, and left him a voicemail saying that I had made up the whole case, that Malik never wanted me in the house, and I was using elder abuse tactics to take everything from her. And what she didn't know was that Deshaun had already spoken to me, that he had already seen the court documents and the letter Malik wrote, and sent me a message right after receiving it, with only one line, "She's desperate." And I didn't reply because there was nothing more to say. And by Thursday, her car was already loaded with her last belongings. Her face was pale. Her makeup was smeared under her eyes as if she would finally have realized that it wasn't just a legal loss. It was personal. It was public and permanent. And that morning, she arrived at the door with her last bag in her hand and said, "You don't have to do this." And I said, "Neither did you." And she stepped back as if she hadn't expected that response, as if she wanted me to get dramatic. Maybe I'd yell or cry or give her another reason to tell the world that I was the villain. But I stood there, still and calm, watching her process the truth in real time, that she had played all the cards, refuted all the lies, and had ended up exactly where it began, standing on a porch that never belonged to her, with a future she couldn't sell. I opened the door and told her, "You have until midnight." And she asked, "Where am I supposed to go?" I looked her in the eyes and said, "Anywhere but here." And then I closed the door, not to be cruel, but to end it. And I watched her from the window while standing on the porch for a whole minute, frozen before finally walking to her car, slamming the trunk shut, and driving off without looking back. And I didn't cry. I didn't applaud. I didn't feel triumphant. I simply felt exhausted. And when the sun set, I turned off the porch light, locked the door, and for the first time in months, I allowed myself to sit in silence, without hearing her footsteps or watching my back, because she was finally gone and the house was mine again, clean and with no one to claim it. And I thought that was the end of it until I walked into the room and saw the small USB drive that she had left on the coffee table, silver, unlabeled. There it was, lying like bait, and it made my stomach churn because Jasmine never left anything unless she wanted me to find it. I stared at the USB drive on the coffee table for a good while, without touching it, without moving it, because I knew Jasmine hadn't left it by accident. Not after all I had done, not when every one of her movements were calculated and cloaked in false sincerity. And I thought about leaving it alone, throwing it away, pretending it didn't exist. But after everything I had survived, I wasn't going to end this story with a loose end. So I connected it to Malik's old laptop, the one he never touched, because he said it smelled of dust and sorrow, and I waited for the screen to light up. A folder with no password, just a file labeled Open Me, and inside there was a video. The footage was grainy at first, then became clearer as the camera stabilized. It showed Jasmine sitting in Malik's office, the same chair I used to check my email. She looked directly into the webcam and said, "If you're watching this, either I'm leaving or you think you've won." Her tone was calm but petulant, as if she were still playing chess mentally, and continued, "I did what I had to do, and maybe I went too far, but I never assumed you were going to stay here forever. You were a substitute, a guest who lingered longer than she should have." And then she leaned forward, her gaze fixed, her expression steady, and her voice low. "Malik wanted you gone before he died. He simply didn't have the guts to say it." And I stopped the video, my jaw clenched, my heart accelerated, because even now she was trying to sow doubt, trying to cling to the one thing she could never accept, my bond with my son. But I pressed play again and saw what she said. I told him we could build something if we had the space, if you could finally leave the past behind. But he was weak. He couldn't cut the cord, so I had to do it for him. And then she smiled, as if it were some kind of victory, as if isolating him from me was an act of love instead of control. And it ended. "You can keep the house, Helen, but you'll never forget this." And the screen went black. I sat there, seated for a moment in the silence that followed, without anger, not even surprise, because that's how it always was with her, controlling, cruel, always needing the last word. But what she didn't know was that I already had the only thing that mattered, the handwritten letter from Malik, the one she could never fake or overwrite, the one in which he said, "I'm sorry," and told me the truth that she had been trying for months to hide. And I took that letter out of the drawer. I held it next to the still image of her on the laptop, and I felt at peace, because in the end, it wasn't about proving who was right. It was about surviving long enough to see her lose control. I took out the USB drive, threw it in the trash, and deleted the file from my laptop. Not because I was afraid of her lies, but because I no longer needed reminders. The war was over, the house was silent, and all the rooms were finally mine again. And that night, I unpacked my last things from the boxes she had labeled for her move. I put Malik's picture back on the shelf in the entryway. I lit a candle in the kitchen and sat alone at the table, without feeling lonely, simply still, simply present, simply free. And as I sipped my tea and listened to the silence that no longer conveyed tension or fear, I looked through the window toward the porch she once tried to claim, and I whispered, "My house, my rules." And I smiled because for the first time since the funeral, I was able to breathe in a space that was entirely my own, not because I fought for it, but because I never let her take it from me.